Let me review first those 4 facts which I claim any historical hypothesis must account for. First, the burial of Jesus. Here we do basically agree on the historicity of the burial account of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea. The question is the significance of this. Dr. Ludemann says that if the Christians did not begin to preach in Jerusalem until 40 days had elapsed, there might have been considerable decay of the body, so that it wouldn't have been easily identifiable, and moreover the book of Acts is legendary anyway, and it might have been even later than that, and therefore they couldn't identify the body. I think this argument is unpersuasive, however, because if the tomb were occupied by a rotted or decayed corpse, no matter how degraded, any corpse in that tomb would have shown that in fact the resurrection had not occurred. As long as the site of the tomb were known and it was occupied by a corpse, the burden of proof would be on the disciples to show that it wasn't Jesus. The presumption would lie with the Jewish authorities that it was Jesus. So the actual degradation of the corpse would do nothing to support the disciples. It would, on the contrary, put a real burden on them to explain how they could believe in the resurrection in the face of an occupied tomb containing the decayed remains of presumably Jesus of Nazareth. Moreover, I would suggest that the book of Acts is not legendary in what it says with regard to the preaching of the disciples in Jerusalem. I can simply refer you here to a fine book by a classical historian, Colin Hemer, called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. Hemer combs through the book of Acts to find a wealth of historical detail, right down to details so peculiar and particular that only an eyewitness on the scene would have been able to be aware of them. So I don't think that we have any reason to doubt the substantial historicity of Acts in this regard. But in any case, the presence of an occupied tomb in Jerusalem would have effectively silenced any budding Christian movement founded on belief in the resurrection of Jesus. What about then the second point, the historicity of the empty tomb? Again, as far as I can see, all 5 lines of evidence that I've given have remained unrefuted in tonight's debate. It's in Mark's early source material. It's implied in 1 Corinthians 15 in 2 ways. Mark's account is simple and lacks signs of legendary embellishment. We've agreed that the women's role shows that they were probably involved in finding the tomb empty. And remember, the earliest Jewish polemic that the disciples stole the body itself shows that the tomb was empty. So I don't think we've got any good reason to doubt the historicity of the empty tomb tonight. What about the third point, the resurrection appearances? Again, I see no refutation of the fundamental point here that the disciples, after the crucifixion of Jesus, did experience these appearances of him alive. The question will be, how do you best explain these? As hallucinations, or that Jesus really did rise from the dead? And finally, number 4, the origin of the disciples' belief. Here, if I understand him correctly, Dr. Ludemann seems to be propounding the extraordinary hypothesis that Jesus prepared his disciples for belief in his resurrection. Now, I find that astonishing because even his own theory, and the bulk of the evidence is that the disciples were utterly unprepared for the catastrophe of the crucifixion. The crucifixion completely undid any hopes that they might have had for Jesus being Messiah. They weren't expecting a resurrection from the dead. If you do accept that Jesus prepared the disciples in this way, what evidence is there of that? Perhaps you could say, well, his resurrection predictions that the Son of Man will rise again after 3 days. But the evidence in the Gospels is that the disciples didn't understand these predictions. They thought he meant the resurrection at the end of the world. That's why they said, we thought Elijah had to come first. They didn't have any inkling the resurrection of Jesus would occur within history. But moreover, if you do accept the historicity of the prophecies, then why don't you accept the historicity of the narratives as well? That's scholarly pick and choose. The resurrection narratives, including the empty tomb, are far better attested historically than the fact of Jesus' resurrection predictions. So it's impossible to arbitrarily say, well, I believe in the resurrection predictions while rejecting the historicity of the empty tomb stories and the appearance stories. So I think we've got the origin of the disciples' belief left to explain. Now, what is the best explanation of these? I suggested that the hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead meets all 6 criteria for the best explanation. And Dr. Ludemann's only objection to this, as I say, is, can we really believe in miracles? Well, if God exists. Now, if God does not exist, as he believes, the type of God he described, then no, you can't believe in miracles. But if the existence of God is even possible, then you've got to be open to the evidence that a miracle has occurred. Klaus Berger has commented that normal Protestant liberalism, in its flat denial of miracles, is a form of rationalistic cultural imperialism. It says our limited powers of perception is the yardstick for absolutely everything in the world. And I want to suggest that the world may be a far more wonderful place than this sort of liberal theology imagines. If God does exist, then miracles are possible, and therefore the resurrection hypothesis is unobjectionable. Now, what about the hallucination hypothesis? Dr. Ludemann didn't deny that it had weak explanatory scope. It doesn't account for all the evidence. It has weak explanatory power in that it can't account for the diversity of the beliefs, and it can't explain belief in Jesus' resurrection in particular. Remember, that resurrection belief is just as early as the belief in Jesus' exaltation. I also suggested, thirdly, that it was implausible in 2 ways. First, little plausibility in its psychoanalysis of Peter and Paul. First of all, it's based upon the depth psychology of Jung, which has yet to be rendered plausible tonight, so it can't exceed that in plausibility. There's insufficient data, and again, he didn't respond to that with respect to Peter. There just isn't any data about Peter's state of mind. And thirdly, as to Paul's having a guilt complex, his only evidence is that Paul's zeal in persecuting the early church shows that he was secretly attracted to what he attacks. Well, that is far, far too simplistic and naive to be a plausible psychoanalysis. There's no evidence that Paul's zeal did not spring out of a genuine zeal for the traditions of his Jewish belief, just as the Nazi Gestapo persecutors weren't secretly attracted to Judaism in their zealous persecution of the Jews in National Socialist Germany. That's far too naive to say that anybody that's zealous really has a guilt complex and is secretly attracted to what he persecutes. There's also little plausibility that the appearances were mere visions as well. Remember, Paul, if anything in 1 Corinthians, is engaging in special pleading to put himself in the list with the apostles. There's no reason to reduce their experiences to his. So in all of these ways, I think when you look at those 6 criteria for weighing the best explanation, the only thing against the resurrection hypothesis is that it's admittedly miraculous. But the hallucination hypothesis has weak explanatory scope, weak explanatory power. It's implausible, it contradicts accepted beliefs, and in multiple ways, I think, fails as the best explanation. And therefore, it follows, I think, that the evidence supports that God raised Jesus from the dead.
Okay. Mr. Bennett?